Transitioning from one White House administration to another has always been a tricky process, and some are a little more difficult than others, as we just experienced. With so many questions, we can thankfully look to our 30th president for a little guidance and perspective. Our discussion about how to exit the presidency is next. I'm Jim Douglas, four-term governor of Vermont and big fan of our 30th president, Calvin Coolidge. Using his barometer for governmental do's and don'ts, we'll dive into today's most important issues and chat about how Silent Cal might have handled them. This is the Coolidge Way, proudly presented by the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. No interregnum in memory has resembled the transition between President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden. The rancor has not abated since the first Tuesday in November. It culminated with the awful sight of Americans furious at President Trump's defeat, storming the Capitol. Politicians from both parties are still slinging invective at each other. This is a battle of words between the elected on the one hand and the newly out on the other. So what is the right kind of transition? How do you exit? How do you treat those who exited? And what are transitions for? Calvin Coolidge had an answer. The work of transitions, Coolidge believed, is to restore faith in institutions, bipartisan faith. That is, to make clear that institutions, not men or women, are what is important in America. Let's talk today about some of Calvin's rules. The first, draw a line between the campaign period and after it, the period of government. When the election ends, the campaign should be over. Here's Coolidge Foundation student Sam Williams of Birmingham, Alabama, who will read a section of a very important 1919 Coolidge speech at Boston's Tremont Temple.
When this campaign is over, it will be a rash man who will again attempt to further his selfish interest by dragging a great party name in the mire and seeking to gain the honor of office by trafficking in disorder. The conduct of public affairs is not a game. Responsible office does not go to the crafty. Governments are not founded upon an association for public plunder, but on the cooperation of men, wherein each is seeking to do his duty.
Doing our duty. What's interesting about that speech is the context. It was delivered when Coolidge, then Massachusetts governor, was actually running for re-election. In fact, his election was just days away, and Coolidge very well might lose. That was because, just a bit before, the Boston police had broken their contract by going on strike. With the patrolmen off duty, looters took over the city. They busted windows, burgled stores, and caused injury and violence. Coolidge sided with the law and fired the policemen for their offense and called in the state guard. In the speech, Coolidge was saying, "After this difficult year, let's pull together, especially after the coming election that I know I might lose." And he might have lost. Coolidge, in fact, wrote his father in Vermont that his tough decision to fire strikers might cost him the election. But he added this comment for his dad: "It is necessary to make sacrifices for the welfare of the state. I am willing to make mine." Coolidge had sympathy with the policemen, but he never condoned the violence that they caused by walking off the job. And even as he campaigned for re-election, he sent a message to everyone in his state: violence is never the way, even when you're losing. For America to continue, there must be a faith in, as he put it, the authority and sanctity of the law. Coolidge added,
"When that goes, all goes. It costs something, but it is the cheapest thing that can be bought. It causes some inconvenience, but it is the foundation of all convenience, the orderly execution of the laws."
As it happened, Coolidge did win his gubernatorial election and the respect of many Americans, including President Woodrow Wilson. Soon Coolidge was in Washington, serving as vice president to Warren Harding. Sometimes the vice presidency was a purgatory. It often is. President Harding lived high, partying in the White House, and there were rumors of White House corruption. This pained the ascetic and modest Coolidge. Fate brought a tragedy. In 1923, President Harding died, and suddenly Coolidge was president. And president at a difficult moment. With each day that passed, the new president and the nation saw more clearly that Harding had besmirched the presidency, with not just partying, but a genuine abuse. Harding had looked away as friends of cabinet members had handed out prized energy contracts to their own favorites. If Coolidge didn't act, his party, he himself, and the presidency would suffer. What to do? That leads us to Coolidge Rule number 2. Respect the formality of transition. In doing so, you strengthen the office, benefiting the whole nation. Coolidge set out to clean up the presidency by showing that above all, he respected the office. Coolidge showed respect by rigorously overseeing the investigation into the officials involved in the Teapot Dome scandal. Since Harding and Coolidge were, of course, both Republicans, Coolidge wanted the investigation to be fair. So the new president appointed 2 special investigators, one from each party, and he saw the process through to the prosecution of the criminals. It's interesting to note that Coolidge never smeared Harding himself. He did not virtue signal by disavowing the late president. Coolidge was always respectful of Harding because he had passed away and he had held the office of the president. The point was to get America past the scandal, not unnecessarily trash everyone or our institutions. You don't want the institutions to suffer collateral damage. Instead of criticizing Harding as a way of defining a better presidency, Coolidge tried to clean up the presidency by example. Coolidge rigorously eschewed favoritism and made sure that his cabinet knew he would not tolerate it or corruption on their part. Coolidge lived by example in his personal life, too. Once in the White House with his bride, Grace, Coolidge insisted that his family live a simple life, the opposite of the Harding style. The New Englander made sure he and his family lived quietly. Coolidge even took measures to reduce White House entertainment, going so far as to fire Mrs. Jaffray, a housekeeper whose events Coolidge rated too lavish. Finally, Coolidge made sure that Americans knew the presidency was not about him, but about the office. That is, he tried not to showcase himself. Once, when Coolidge was out walking with a senator, the senator pointed to the White House and asked, joking, what lucky fellow got to live there? Nobody, replied Coolidge. They just come and go. Later, after the presidency, Coolidge took up the restraint theme again, writing, it is a great advantage to a president and a major source of safety to the country for him to know he is not a great man. Today, both parties seem to be continuing to campaign even after the election. The partisan barbs are still flying. Coolidge believed that in a transition, such behavior was wrong. In the transition period, everyone must behave with utmost dignity and respect. A final Coolidge rule: know how to exit. Knowing when to leave office is very tough. I myself confronted this challenge. Should I stay 3 terms, 4, 5? But it seemed good to leave before they invited me to go. Coolidge had the same philosophy and applied it in historically dramatic fashion. Coolidge had only been elected once, in 1924, so America expected him to run again in 1928. The Republican Party expected him to run again. Indeed, the Republican Party was counting on him to run again because Coolidge was so popular. But Coolidge saw matters differently. In the summer of 1927, he wrote a sentence over and over on pieces of paper and handed it to reporters. It said, I do not choose to run for president in 1928. This decision by the popular president was not popular. The Republican Party was furious. That felt rough. What made it all personally rougher was that Coolidge didn't exactly like his successor candidate, Herbert Hoover. Privately, Coolidge called Hoover Wonder Boy. But Coolidge did all he could to show public respect for Hoover. For Coolidge indeed saw that the transition of power mattered more to America in the long run than any individual, and that everyone should behave in doubly gracious fashion in a solemn period of transition. These 3 Coolidge rules are important. Know when an election is over, even if you don't like the result. Respect the formality of the transition. Know when to go, and do it gracefully. Two of the nation's top presidential experts will join us to weigh in on this topic in just a moment. Before we get to that, it's time for our Calvin Coolidge Pop Quiz. Of all these elected positions, which office did Coolidge not hold? City councilman, county clerk, mayor, governor, and U.S. senator. Think that over, and we'll have the answer at the end of this episode. I also want to take a moment to let you know how you can get in touch with us. Send us your thoughts on this podcast at coolidgefoundation.org/The Coolidge Way, or by visiting our social pages on Facebook or Twitter. We'd love to see your comments on this episode and any ideas you have for future topics. I'm thrilled to be joined now by two guests who know just about everything about the presidency. Amity Shlaes is the chair of the Calvin Coolidge Foundation and noted scholar and writer of such terrific books as Coolidge, The Forgotten Man, The Greedy Hand, and Great Society, A New History. Alan Lowe is one of the nation's most respected presidential historians. He's been in charge of several different presidential libraries and museums across the country, and now hosts the very successful podcast, American POTUS. Thank you both for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Great to join you, Governor. Thank you.
Amity, I'll turn to you first. Calvin Coolidge had such a deep reverence for American institutions. How can we today create and sustain such respect among all citizens, and especially with those we lift up to lead us? In particular, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the role of education.
Well, Governor Jim, you just hit on the purpose of the Coolidge Foundation, which is to impart Coolidge principles, including an understanding of the importance of institutions, discussion, and civility to young people. So we have a high school debate program where kids learn through debate, through a sport, which is fun, how to talk to one another and how Coolidge talked to other people. When he was a young man, Coolidge was very shy. He was a timid child, and he found himself. He found his modus operandi through debate. And we watch so many young people do that. All our young people debate both sides of an argument. We make sure they do, because until you try on an argument, you don't see its merit. It's good to walk in someone else's shoes. So that's a wonderful program, culminating in a contest at Plymouth Notch, the presidential site and birthplace, which is also in and of itself, even for non-debaters, for all visitors, so compelling. When you go to Coolidge's grave, you see it is not taller than the graves next to it. How could a man be the first American and be equal among others? That's what Coolidge wanted to show. He surely liked having a modest grave with just the presidential mark on it with the eagle and so on, if you scrutinize it closely. But from a distance, it looks like just another grave. It makes a great impression on Americans who visit.
And Governor, if I might add, I really applaud all the work that goes on at the Coolidge Foundation. Throughout my career, I've worked with a lot of really good folks, both in the institutions where I've been director and among schools at every level. And I realized the importance of teaching American history. It's something that's just not done as much as it should be. We don't get the examples from the past. We don't get the perspective that knowing the past gives. And we don't really understand fully how unique and special America is if we don't learn that history. And I guess connected to that as well, I would say, and this is where the debating program comes in so much with the Coolidge Foundation, a knowledge of civics. If you want our young people to grow up and to be civically engaged and to deal with one another civilly within that system, they have to understand how it works. You can't have civic engagement, without civic literacy. So again, really stressing the importance of programs like the one at the Coolidge Foundation, but also within schools, re-emphasizing the teaching of American history and civics and world history as well. That gives a perspective. It gives examples that these young folks can go out in the world as they take over leadership and we impart that to them, and they can actually go out and put those into action.
One of the things about Coolidge as a boy was that he spent a lot of time watching. He went to the town meeting of Plymouth Notch. Sometimes he sold apples there, and he got to watch the other citizens, the grown-ups, and how they comported himself. And in his autobiography, he speaks about a Democrat, the Coolidges were not Democrats, who played a role in the town, and the respect with which his father and grandfather treated that gentleman, and that stuck with him. If you listen to your parents slime people, then you become a slimer yourself and you lose something. So at the foundation, we invest very heavily in this program in order to give a sense to kids of the old town meeting, the old America of Alexis de Tocqueville.
We have to give that example to our kids. You're right, Amity. I remember as a child going out with my mother and campaigning. She would go out and pass out campaign literature. I helped her work the polls, but I saw people getting along. It was part of the electoral process. It wasn't fighting or yelling or calling names. There was a real kind of collegial atmosphere there of people wanting to do the right thing and to give back to society in some way. We have to set that example.
You mentioned Coolidge's autobiography, which is, of course, predictably briefer than many, but in there he talks a lot about his educational background, at some length, really, both at the secondary and collegiate level. He went into a lot of detail about the importance of education, as it gave him a foundation for his experiences later in life. That's what the foundation is determined to continue to exemplify and encourage more young people to fulfill their educational experiences and become contributing members of our society.
And Governor, I would say also that as we work with schools and other organizations in the teaching of history, it's important for them to provide a variety of perspectives and to show students how to research primary documents. As a person who over the years has overseen a variety of wonderful archives, being able to dig into those primary sources, kind of look at the raw material of history, is really informative and eye-opening, I think, for students. So I know there's only so much time in a school day, but being able to incorporate those materials into teaching, I think, opens a lot of doors in the understanding of history.
One of the reasons Coolidge knew how to exit was he read about people who exited before him. George Washington, for example, or the great Romans. And that must be part of the story as well. When Coolidge was a young man, he campaigned very professionally, and I often wondered whether he read the campaign guide of Quintus Cicero, the brother of Cicero, because they were all the same rules. So I guess what we're saying is when you know how to behave as a grown-up civic leader, that has to come from somewhere, and it's very important that we provide knowledge of the American past and of the classics and of the European past, so young people can take it all in and form their own opinion and comport themselves accordingly.
And then that has to go into an atmosphere of civility, where we can then utilize those lessons in a civil manner in dealing with one another.
Coolidge was once asked why he didn't engage in negative campaigning, and he very appropriately replied, "I always thought it was more useful to explain why I ought to be hired rather than why the other person ought not to be." Gosh, I wish all of our candidates today could listen to the advice of our 30th president. You know, Coolidge was often referred to, and still is, as Silent Cal, but in a way that's a misnomer, isn't it? He was reserved, certainly, and thought before he spoke, but he wasn't silent, was he?
Oh, not at all. We do have on the Coolidge website, and we hope you join us at the Coolidge Foundation website to become a Coolidge scribe, which is an editor of Coolidge documents. Among the documents there, searchable PDFs, are Coolidge's press conferences. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of those press conferences. They were off the record, which means they showed up in the paper something like the White House may have said. But he was in constant contact, contrary to rumor, Coolidge was, with the press and thought quite a bit about imparting information to the United States. We hope you have a look at all that, and we have an issue of the Coolidge Quarterly coming up shortly about the pitfalls of speaking off the record, because Coolidge, of course, was sometimes misinterpreted. In the 20s, people were not angels either. And have a look at that as well, because he was.
I'll just add to that, Governor, as I've been working with you and with Amity and learning even more about Calvin Coolidge, reading his autobiography, reading his speeches. He had a lot to say and a lot of wise things to say. That's why I'm really glad to be part of the Coolidge Way to show people today that this was a man who had some really important thoughts that are extraordinarily useful to us in the 21st century.
We know that after Coolidge left the White House, he continued to have his voice heard on a wide range of issues, sometimes disagreeing with the actions of the new president, Herbert Hoover, about whom we spoke earlier, someone of whom he wasn't particularly fond. How did he and how should we differentiate respectful disagreement from disrespectful argument? How can we draw that line to ensure we maintain a basis of civility in our political discussions, even when we have serious and profound disagreements?
Well, that line is pretty clear. You talk about the policies, not the person. Whenever someone says someone else is stupid, you know he doesn't have much evidence for his argument, right? Because he's descended to ad hominem. Coolidge didn't do that. He stuck to the issues. Actually, he was pretty civil, even on the policy, towards President Hoover. He wanted the Republicans to win. He was a Republican. I go up or down with my party, Coolidge said. So he didn't spell it out, but you can sense disagreement in his wonderful columns that he wrote, collected now in a book called Calvin Coolidge Says. Well, Coolidge didn't like to berate business. Hoover did. Hoover berated the stock market, sort of a la GameStop. You did the wrong thing. You're bad short sellers. Coolidge never was comfortable with something like that. So you can sense the tension in his post-presidential columns, but mostly he tried to take a different tack. And in that, he reminds me, if I dare say, a little bit of President George Bush, who isn't commenting particularly on politics, but comes at the world elliptically through his paintings. For example, he painted veterans to show his appreciation of their service. He didn't say, I advocate spending more on the military than we're spending, or I have this and that to say about President Trump or President Obama. Instead, he just painted the veterans. He's a hobby painter, and that was the way he expressed himself in a way that was useful to all. Anyone can appreciate art, whatever party he or she is, and even if it's by a former president from one party. So I think that's quite gracious and wise of President Bush, and Coolidge was similar in that way. His art was his writing.
And I would add, Governor, I worked for years with Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, a really great and good man who found fame in the Watergate hearings and Senate Minority and Majority Leader, but he imparted a lot of wisdom to me over the years, and I try to listen to it. And a lot of it was about civility, how to work together, and how to affect good public policy. And two big rules he always gave to everyone, almost like a mantra, one was you have to have a decent respect for differing points of view. You're not going to get anything done if you go in and don't have at least a respect of the person that you may be debating with, but you have to have respect for their right to have that opposing view. And also, he said, I don't assume I'm always right. The other guy might end up being correct. I want to learn. At the end of the day, I may still disagree with him or her, but I need to hear them out. And at the end of the day, we can work together then, perhaps to find a middle ground to move forward with good public policy. So I think I've always tried to hold that near to my heart of how I approach things. And certainly I think our government would be better off if we would approach public policy in that way.
You know, Coolidge grew up in the era before the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. It was so in his lifetime, while he was growing up, senators were picked by state legislatures. And today we look upon that as anti-democratic. The amendment made it so that voters pick senators just as they pick congressmen. But there was an upside to the Senate. It was that they knew each other. It was an old boys club, to be sure, but they knew each other and they had more respect for each other because the senators just structurally were not merely playing to voters. They were playing also to fellow lawmakers, whether in their state or in Washington. And Coolidge expressed some ambivalence about recent amendments to the Constitution in his autobiography. And I think he understood what was lost with the shift of the 17th Amendment. Won't go farther than that. Won't say he wanted to reverse it, but he understood there's always a trade-off when you change law through an amendment to the Constitution, and that the brotherhood, the fraternity of the Senate had some upside in terms of trust, collegiality, and bipartisanship. They weren't just playing to Twitter.
Even after that time, Senator Baker talked about the reduction in kind of the personal interaction of senators over time. So it's hard to play a softball game or have a drink with someone if you've demonized them. A lot got done, frankly, behind the scenes, having a drink together or, having dinner or something like that, rather than this constantly going and, like you say, going to Twitter and demonizing your opponents, trying to make a political point. That kind of behind the scenes, getting to know one another was extraordinarily helpful in moving the process forward in a civil way.
And now, of course, they spend very little time in Washington because they're campaigning or fundraising. Not, as you suggest, Alan, getting to know one another and getting to know each other's families and developing the kind of personal relationship that's really beneficial to the work that's in front of them. Speaking of senators, I recall dealing with state senators in Vermont who were predominantly of the other party, and we had some knockdown, drag-out battles over various issues before the legislature. At one point, the leader of the Senate said to his colleagues, the same people who elected us elected the governor. So maybe we have a responsibility to try and work with him and find some common ground. Well, I think that's the way Coolidge believed things should happen in Washington. Respect for the voters who might have made a different decision in some states or congressional districts, but a responsibility to work together. Alan, you've had a lot of experience with a variety of our presidents throughout history, in addition to Calvin Coolidge. Do you think of other examples of good political exits?
I think there are several, Governor, and Amity referenced earlier back to the father of our country, George Washington. Obviously, he set the precedent in so many ways for us. He set down his sword after the Revolution. He stepped down after his 2 terms as president, all kind of earth-shattering things. But perhaps after that, the first one to talk about will be John Adams. He was defeated in his bid for re-election, very bitter about that, didn't talk to his former friend Thomas Jefferson for many years afterwards. But he set the precedent in that even though he was mad, he left when he was defeated. He went back home and set us on the road to peaceful transitions. His son was much the same way when he was defeated in his bid for re-election by his nemesis, Andrew Jackson. He left. He didn't attend the inauguration. He was very mad, but he did leave office. And he had a great career afterwards in Congress as Old Man Eloquent, arguing against slavery. You can look to more modern day, obviously George H.W. Bush, a good man too, when he lost in 1992, showed great integrity and grace, I believe. He left Bill Clinton a famous note in the Oval Office that said, "Your success now is our country's success. I'm rooting hard for you." Bush felt horrible. He felt unappreciated, thrown aside, but he had the character to take that defeat, and he knew that love of country and love of office was important, and that's where he put the priority. George W. Bush left office not in defeat, but the opposing party came into power when he left with Barack Obama. Of course, George and Laura welcomed Barack and Michelle with open arms. He arranged to have all the former presidents there to support President Obama, and he left a note as well, and I looked up what that said. It told the new incoming President Obama that you will have an almighty God to comfort you, a family who loves you, and a country that is pulling for you, including me. So these presidents, whether they went out on their own after 2 terms or they were defeated, gave us examples of the process working, of respecting the institution of the presidency and the republic itself. It's extraordinarily important for our continued survival as a republic for that to be the case.
What a great discussion we've had about presidential exits, Calvin Coolidge, and others. I want to thank you, Amity and Alan, for joining us on this episode. It's really a great insight on how Coolidge and others would have handled this delicate situation of presidential transitions. Amity, while I have you here, what interesting things are going on at or coming up with the Coolidge Foundation?
Well, this particular period, Governor Jim, is like a rainy day through a blurry window. We know there's a future ahead, but we don't quite know what it is. So I'm going to speak about the far future when it will be bright. 2023 is the centennial of the Coolidge presidency, and we will be arranging events at Plymouth Notch. We will have on our website shortly a special bulletin board page about different ways you can celebrate the centennial of this unusual president. Meantime, if you're stuck at home bored waiting for your vaccination, the Scribe program is our Coolidge virtual library. And the virtual library aims to contain every document Coolidge wrote and every speech he uttered. What citizens do is they edit these speeches with our help, upload them, proofread them, and then write their own comment about the meaning of the Coolidge content to them. It's a wonderful way to be a living librarian for a wonderful president.
A lot of exciting things going on, Amity, at the Coolidge Foundation. That's great. And opportunities for our listeners to get involved. I want to encourage you all to go to the foundation website, coolidgefoundation.org, and join us as we prepare for the centennial of the presidential inauguration just a couple of years from now. The Coolidge Way is a production of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation with offices in Plymouth Notch, Vermont and Washington, D.C. Special thanks to our guests, Amity Shlaes and Alan Lowe, as well as Coolidge Foundation student Sam Williams of Birmingham, Alabama, who read some very important quotes from our 30th president. If you have any thoughts, questions, or comments on this episode or any other, please don't hesitate to send me a note at coolidgefoundation.org/The Coolidge Way or on one of our social pages. Earlier in this episode, our Calvin Coolidge Pop Quiz asked you this question. Of all these elected positions, which office did Coolidge not hold? City Councilman, County Clerk, Mayor, Governor, and U.S. Senator. U.S. Senator is the answer. He was a state senator in Massachusetts, but never a United States Senator. We hope you got that one right. I'm former Vermont Governor Jim Douglas. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again for another episode of The Coolidge Way.